stands at Rubicon, and the question is, should he cross over at Rubicon and march towards Rome or not? And Suetonius tells us that at that moment, Julius Caesar had a vision. Something supernatural happened, and he saw a being playing music for him in a vision. And he, Julius Caesar, interpreted that as a sign from the gods that he should cross the river and go towards Rome. Okay, here is a reference to the supernatural. Must we dismiss what Suetonius says about Julius Caesar? And the answer is no. We do not need to accept this reference to the supernatural and believe in the vision or that this was a signal from God, but we can still obtain historical knowledge about what happened in Julius Caesar's life and at this time and place. It's the same with the New Testament. No one needs to take all the supernatural or these supernatural references at face value. But that they are there is not something that undermines the New Testament as a historical source about Jesus. How you view the supernatural is not a scientific question, it's not a historical question, it's a philosophical question. What kind of worldview you have. Secondly, other people say, well, the Gospels, they're too personal, they're too subjective, they are, we want really historical material, objective material. The Gospels, they're written by his friends, by his disciples, they believed in him. They followed him. We would like a better material about Jesus. Okay, as a response to that, I usually ask a question. Can you give me an example of a really objective historical source? It's often a long silence because that's not really easy. All historical material are written by one individual instead of another, from one perspective instead of another perspective, giving one interpretation of events instead of another interpretation of events. All written material have a certain subjectivity with it. So we just have to deal with it. Secondly, is it positive or negative that a text about a historical individual is written by this individual's friends? This is, for me, a very important question. Let me give you an example. We take someone else from antiquity and we ask the question, how can we actually know things about a person from antiquity? Let's take this old man, Socrates, the world-famous philosopher, Socrates. Dictionary knowledge about him would tell us something like this. He was a philosopher, 400 BC. He lived in Athens. He had his own teaching method. He was not using PowerPoints. He was using very probing questions, forcing his students to draw their own conclusions, to help them themselves to distinguish between what is true and false. And he became very popular. Young people loved him. But he also had some enemies in Athens. And they set up a trial, and he was falsely accused and falsely sentenced to death and executed. Some similarities actually with Jesus from Nazareth. Now, how do we know this about Socrates? Where does this information come from? Well, it comes basically from four main sources. These are Aristophanes, who was a contemporary comedy writer who wrote about Socrates. Secondly, they come from Plato, who was the disciple of Socrates during 8 years' time. And after Socrates' death, and during a period of 50 years, he wrote a number of books about his master. Thirdly, it's Xenophon, who was Socrates' friend. Xenophon was not himself such a bright philosopher, so he cannot capture the philosophical mind of Socrates, but he wrote instead 3 friend books about his friend Socrates. And then it's Aristotle, who was the disciple to Plato, and 50 to 60 years after Socrates' death, he wrote about Socrates. Now, historians say there is a special value in 2 of those sources. And that is first, Plato. Because he was the disciple of Socrates. He really knew the thinking, the teaching of Socrates. And secondly, it's Xenophon. Because he was Socrates' friend. He knew him. Therefore, those 2 sources are of special value for our investigation into who Socrates was. And we can understand this. Every human being has a circle of other people around them who knows that person better than the rest of humankind. You have that. You know, if we were to write a book about you, and for some strange reason we cannot interview you, what would we then like to do? We would like to come in contact to this close circle of people around you, your family and your friend, and people, if you have any, who are your disciples, who can tell about you. That's the best kind of source of information. And you see where I'm going. It's not a negative aspect of the Gospels, the main source about Jesus, that they came from his friends and disciples. It means the information in them comes from people who really knew. That makes it highly interesting to read. It comes from a really close circle around Jesus. Then a number of other objections are coming. But, okay. Maybe the main source have some relationship to him, to this person, that they really knew him. But still, what they have written, is that really historical material? It's such a churchy stuff, and so, you know, we have it for sermons and devotions, and it's used, you have it in leather books with gold on the side, and is this historical material? It seems like religious, mystical texts more. Actually, a number of theologians have had this perspective for several hundred years. So, for example, again, the former Archbishop in Sweden, Kogahama, he has written, the Gospels are, by their character, faith witnesses. They gave us a testimony about the faith amongst the first Christians, but not about the historical Jesus. So his perspective is, these are not historical sources about Jesus. These texts reflect just what the Christians or what the church thought about Jesus, dreamt about Jesus, hoped about Jesus, maybe a year 90 or year 100 or something. So we are coming in contact with Christian sermons, not historical information about Jesus. Okay, what to say about that? Here the question of genre is absolutely decisive. What kind of texts are these? I hope you have your imagination with you. We'd like to invite you to a thought experiment. You have just been offered a new job at the daily newspaper here in Turku. Okay, your job is to open all the post that is coming. Well, it's modern day, so you have to read all the mails in the inbox. Hundreds of mails come. And you need to be really clever in understanding what kind of texts you are receiving. Because you are to read all these mails and then forward them to different departments at the newspaper, and then they will come into different sections in the newspaper. And all different kinds of texts are coming. Very serious, heavy political editorials discussing world affairs. And then very humoristic chronicles, and then sarcastic texts, and then you have a lot of advertisements, and you have soup recipe, and then you have very solemn texts about people that has just died, and about bereavement and burials and so on. Now, if you cannot, and you have comics coming in and so on, if you cannot distinguish different genre what a text is, you will be in deep trouble. Publishing sarcastic text as political editorials, mixing soup recipe and text about people that just have died. It will not work. You will be fired. I'm sorry, you're losing your job. Okay, here's a text coming. It's from a guy called Luke. Long text. You have no time to read it all. You can just read the introduction. It says like this, and you have to think, what kind of genre is it? Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the very first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully